Good evening to everyone in Fiji, and I would like to make a presentation uh, which is titled as Caught Between Continents and Great Men, C.F. Andrews' Humanism and the issue of indentured labour in Fiji. Now, in this presentation, I'll briefly relate Andrews' involvement with the issue of indentured labour in Fiji and the interaction between him, Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi on the broader aspects of human life. The biographers of C.F. Andrews, more popularly referred to him by Indians as Dinabandhu Andrews, have emphasized that it was Rabindranath who inspired in him the sense of responsibility to represent the claims of humanity as a whole. But it is an undeniable fact that Andrews himself had a deep commitment towards India, his adopted homeland. From the time he reached Durban in January 1914, he unequivocally expressed his affection and sympathy for the movement waged there by Gandhi, Pollock, and Kallenbach against the illegal imprisonment of Indians in South Africa. Contrary to what his biographers might have written, he did little to hold his unconditional adulation for Gandhi. His first description of Gandhi proves beyond doubt his reverence for Indians. Gandhi is described by Andrews as an ascetic figure with a tonsured head, dressed in a white dhoti, lower cloth, and kurta, upper cloth, made of such coarse material as worn by the indentured labourers. He wrote in this regard, looking as though in mourning, I stopped at once instinctively and touched his feet, and he said in a low voice, "Pray do not do that, it is a humiliation to me." From the late 1890s, Gandhi had been trying to acquaint the people of India about the disabilities faced by their fellow men and women in South Africa. The majority of Indians in South Africa were indentured labourers who were sent to work in the mines and plantations, and they, along with their successors, had contributed a lot to the well-being of the colony. Gandhi's visit to India at this time did not elicit much public response, possibly because the Indian press and political elites felt that a lot of problems were still to be resolved in India. Though Gandhi might have failed in eliciting such response from his own countrymen, there is ample evidence to prove that his own lieutenants like Pollock were able to convince men like Andrews to favorably understand the implications of Gandhi's humanitarian program in South Africa. In this presentation, I seek to argue that much before Andrews had become the bridge between Tagore, and whom he referred to as Gurudev, and Mahatma Gandhi, who was Mohan to him all through, he had shown qualities of deep commitment for humanity, irrespective of race, creed, and religion. His involvement with the Anglican Church did not hold him back from engaging in social communication with Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, and Lady Hardinge, possibly to find ways for resolving the problems faced by the Indians in South Africa. I would argue that these communications in some ways could convince the Viceroy to admit that Indians in South Africa had legitimate grievances. However, the subject matter of this presentation is very different, since it tries to study Andrews' own involvement in eliminating the indentured system in Fiji. I am interested in bringing Andrews' experience in South Africa primarily to comprehend his own understanding of the indentured labour system and the shame and guilt that was associated with it in Fiji and in the other colonies. I would like to clearly state that South African experience proved to be a determining point or a moment that helped him to comprehend the effects of the indenture system on the social psychology of the Indian labouring groups. The other point that needs to be highlighted is that the South African experience led him to appreciate the relevance of the Gandhian insistence on ahimsa and satyagraha. His close camaraderie with William Pearson, a fellow missionary who accompanied him to Durban, made it possible to conduct full-scale investigations into the conditions of the Indian laborers employed in the sugarcane growing plantations in Fiji, in Natal. Sorry. But more importantly, Andrews was convinced of the efficacy of Gandhi's non-violent methods because they were not only acceptable counter mechanisms to prevent conflicts born out of racial hatred and economic discriminations, but they were possibly the best way out to resolve the crisis of humanity. I also intend to argue that Andrews's involvement in the indenture issue in Fiji was also partly related to his own attachment to Christian socialism, which had emerged in Britain during the Victorian period. Christian socialists like Charles Kingsley had expressed their deep empathy for the poor and were pained by the deprivation suffered by them. Kingsley believed that the escape route from this sort of situation lay in the founding of cooperative association, educational institutions, sanitary reforms, recreation, and religion. Andrews inherited many of these ideas of Kingsley, but at the same time, the political side which was wanting in Kingsley's ideas was actually taken up by Andrews himself. Now, in the early 1910s, Andrews had an apprehension that the colonial bureaucracy on which the future of the British Empire and that of British imperialism rested was trying to use the war situation to silence the voice of protests against the empire. In fact, this was very much evident in the blatant racialism and racism that had come to be followed by the ruling elites in South Africa, leading to the denigration of Indian labor. Andrews proved to be one individual who was willing to take up these issues with the colonial bureaucracy. His deep concern for indentured labor in Fiji after his experience in Natal was perhaps aroused by the publication of a book in Hindi, Fiji Deep Mein Mere 21 Varsh, which was an autobiographical account of a former indentured laborer, Totaram Sanadia, which was authored by a well-known Hindi journalist from Allahabad, Banarasi Das Chaturvedi. Andrews' experience in South Africa and his close interactions with Indians convinced him that racism was the root cause of oppression and exploitation in any society. The South African experience had also convinced him of the rigors of plantation life. He was quick to realize the situation in the Fijian sugar fields were no less oppressive than the one in South Africa. To him, the rise in the suicide figures in the plantations in Fiji itself reflected the misery and despair of the emigrants. He had little doubt that the emigrants had been tricked by the professional recruiters, and the system of recruitment itself was too often conducted through illegal means ranging from bribery, drugging to kidnapping. The unequal sex ratio of men and women led to unimaginable sexual envy and the increasing number of incidents of sexual violence in the plantation barracks. Andrews felt that the only way left for him was to convince the colonial bureaucracy of the necessity of bringing the system of indenture to an end. He also felt that on-the-spot investigations had to be carried out for assessing the difficulties confronting the Indian laborers in the plantations. He shared some of his emotions in this respect with Tagore through his correspondences. He squarely blamed the colonial bureaucracy and the Christian Church for creating a situation where racism could thrive in the colonies. In fact, in this regard, his arguments were drawn from his own experiences as a Christian in South Africa. Now, Andrews, when you talk about his involvement in the issue of regarding the issue of indentured labor in Fiji, it would not that the issue of indentured labor in Fiji was just not a matter of concern for Britain and India, but one which would embroil the former into a confrontation with Australian politicians and big business. There are scholars who have argued that in any matter related to the Pacific, British and Australian interests did not always coincide, but rather they collided. In the case of the indentured labour problem in Fiji, it was natural for the Australians to disregard the reformist attitude of the colonial bureaucracy in India. It seemed fair on the part of the Australians to regard the British bureaucracy's move to scuttle the tyranny of indentured system as something dangerous. There was a great deal of resentment in the Australian political circles to accept the nationalist version of the Indian middle class political leadership that indenture system was bad and that it should be brought to an end. Now, until the beginning of the First World War, the immigration policy pursued by the government of India was almost close to an unmitigated disaster for both the Indian settler communities overseas and for the Indian patriots at home. The shortcomings of the British rule in India was more than one way equated with the retention of the indentured immigration, the evils of which were hardly noticed by the government of India. It was only under the viceroyalty of Lord Hardinge that the issue of indenture acquired some bit of importance in the Indian official circles. But it would be wrong to presume that Hardinge would be in favor of accepting the contentions of the report prepared by James McNeill and Chimanlal on the problems related to indentured labour. The Viceroy felt that the evils of the indentured emigration were not as bad as they were alleged to be. The Indian members of the Imperial Legislative Council were anxious to see Andrews undertaking a trip to Fiji, and this sort of anxiousness was also seen on the part of the Indian mercantile community, the Marwaris, who were primarily based in Calcutta. The big Marwari business houses were primarily based in Calcutta, and they also felt that the indenture migration should come to an end, and they were also negotiating with Andrews so that he undertook a trip to Fiji to get a first-hand knowledge of the situation that prevailed there. Now, the trip was partly financed from the South African funds which had been collected by Gokhale to fight for Indian rights in Natal. Andrews was to be accompanied by W. Pearson, a fellow missionary, the cost of his travel being borne by the Anti-Indenture League, which was primarily sponsored by the Marwari trading groups. In October 1915, Andrews undertook the visit to the South Pacific and decided to make halts in Australia and New Zealand and discussed his own ideas about indenture with the politicians and the business lobby in Australia and New Zealand. The Australian response to Andrews was rather hostile, but in New Zealand he found that the Kiwis gave him a much more patient hearing, and the condition of the Indian labourers in Kiwi itself spoke that the conditions in New Zealand were not as bad as the ones in Fiji. Now, to cut short, Andrews and Pearson, they went to the Fijian plantation barracks, and it was based on their own experience that they were going to write a report. It was pointed out that this sort of task work basis, which had been introduced in the Fijian plantations itself, was a matter of concern because the Indian men and women were not accustomed to it. Even the Indian women who signed these documents, mostly their fingerprints are there in the agreements, they couldn't sign in the proper sense. They didn't know that they were taken there for this sort of harsh agricultural work. And furthermore, they came to know that there was discrimination on the lines of gender in the indenture agreements, which were signed by women. They got far less wages compared to the men, though in terms of work or in terms of rigor, the women were facing the same sort of problems as the men. Pearson and Andrews criticized the Fiji government for being a party to these falsified sets of agreements signed in almost blind faith by men and women from India. They were also critical of the Fijian government for not caring about the caste sensibilities of the Hindus. They personally informed the Fijian authorities that Hindus, however low, quote within quotes, in castes, would not accept the work of slaughtering animals. Pearson and Andrews' report also brought out the clear connections between caste and ethnicity in the creation of an atmosphere of servility for the Madrasi coolies or the coolies who came from South India. They also spoke of the deception that was being practiced particularly in enticing communities like the Rajputs to Fiji on the ground that they would be given employment in the Fiji army. Andrews and Pearson did agree with many others that the unequal sex ratio between male and female emigrants was perhaps the most important cause behind the social dislocation that prevailed in Fiji. In their own assessment, there was yet another dimension. The coolies, they felt, were largely recruited on an individual basis, and they hardly came to Fiji on a familial pattern or based on the familial pattern of migration. Pearson and Andrews in their report reiterated the views of the Agent General of Immigration, Fiji, who had argued that the evil of indenture as witnessed in sexual violence resulted from a deficiency of women. He argued that low proportion of indentured women was not something which was accidental or one which could be abandoned without modifying the system. Rather, it was an integral part of the system itself because the Australian employers displayed an eagerness to maintain the sexual imbalances for securing high profits or higher profits. Andrews and Pearson reported that despite their frequent pleas to the planters in Fiji that reforms should be undertaken for constituting or constructing a decent family life for the coolies, there was persistent opposition from the planters who argued that it was not only impossible, but that it would result in very high expenses. Pearson and Andrews also believed that the Memorandum of Agreements for Separation was one of the documents which created confusions over the legality of marriages in Fiji. Interestingly, these documents were equivalent to a divorce, and they were thought to be so by all indentured coolies. Since these documents were drafted by barristers of law in Fiji and printed in court paper with government seal, for all practical purposes it looked to be a valid legal tender, and the Indians, who were by and large illiterate, believed that they were valid in the courts of law. But contrary to what they believed, Pearson and Andrews, in consultation with the lawyers, reached the conclusion that these documents had no such legal validity in Fiji. Finally, it was believed that once the indenture system was abolished and the present system of recruitment stopped, there would be a rapid recovery of the morals of the Indian population. Andrews and Pearson put their faith on the age-old relations that humans had with nature, on the reconstitution of the village life in Fiji, and that's how, with temples and with daily rituals coming back into their lives, men and women would actually forge a relationship with nature, because Hinduism to them essentially meant a connection of the humans with nature. On returning back to India, Pearson and Andrews spent a few days in Shantiniketan. It was in Shantiniketan that the report on Fiji was drafted, and it was formally published in February 1916. The publication had a huge impact on the middle classes of India. Pandit Madan Mohan Malabhya stated that to move a resolution in the Imperial Legislative Council requesting the government of India to abolish the system of indentured labour. Now, at the same time, we find that Lord Hardinge himself congratulated Andrews for preparing this report. Subsequently, on the floors of the Imperial Legislative Council, when the debate was taking place, the Viceroy announced that the government of India would accept abolition in principle, though the system of recruitment of indentured labour would continue until the new conditions of labour recruitment were worked out. Hugh Tinker has argued that this was perhaps the last major statement that Lord Hardinge made as a Viceroy before he left the shores of India towards the end of March 1916. The colonial bureaucracy in London accepted the views of Hardinge with reluctance and felt that Andrews had prepared the report on what he thought and what he imagined. There was no veracity in much of the information that had been penned down in the report. That was the version of the colonial bosses in London. Andrews, in the meantime, accepted Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya's request to take part in the anti-indenture campaign. In 1917, once again, Andrews goes back to Fiji. This is his second trip to Fiji. Though he spent 6 months there in Fiji, his life is that of isolation. He's not in touch with many people, with his old friends, or with many others whom he had met during his first week. He spent more time Fiji, with Manilal Doctor and his wife Jayakumari. Jayakumari had already gained popularity in Fiji, fighting for the cause of the Indian indentured labourers. In his letters to Tagore, Andrews spoke about his isolation and his disappointment for failing to change the situation in Fiji. However, he took pride for his efforts to set up 2 primary schools at Nandi and Sambeto. However, Tagore could not write much to Andrews because his younger daughter was in the deathbed, and Tagore himself was perhaps mentally was not in the best of times. On his return to India, Andrews felt that it was no longer the country that he had been familiar with before leaving for the island colony. The political temper was on the rise. There was growing disenchantment in the nationalist circles over the continuance of the indentured system. Gandhi's involvement in this matter was cut short by his decision to engage with the grievances of the Ahmedabad mill workers who were on the path of a strike. Andrews made it clear to the Secretary of State, Edwin Montagu, and he expressed his opposition to the indentured system. The consequences of this meeting that he had with Edwin Montagu is not difficult to comprehend. The indentured system finally came to an end on January 1st, 1920. Andrews remained somewhat silent in the 1920s about the impact of the indentured system on the lives of the Indian population in the British colonies. But in the 1930s, he did return back to the issue of indenture, and his textual representation was largely based on his own experiences that he had in Fiji in 1915 and 1917. The last visit came in 1936. For Andrews, it was the last time he would visit Fiji. By now, the Indian labourers had been freed from indenture, and the system had been brought to an end. The idea of citizenship had started gaining prominence. Citizenship rights based on education and property qualifications in Fiji had become important because these were being granted by the colonial bureaucracy. But these rights were seriously threatened in 1935, and the Indo-Fijian leaders felt that Andrews had to be invited to defend them once again. Andrews spent some weeks in Fiji and went to every center in the islands where the Indians resided. Andrews' optimism not only brought out the system of adjustment on the part of the former indentured laborers in the colonies, but also the commonality of such experiences of the people of Indian origin in the other British colonies as well. Writing in the mid-1930s, Andrews ended with a note of optimism when it came to defining the problem of racial adjustment, in the colonies. He had a firm belief that the principle of give and take would guide the different peoples of the world, and that all races had to understand the powers of mutual goodwill and human kindness. However, when it came to Fiji, these optimisms were belied because all the expectations that Andrews had stood in the face of a rock. It was very difficult to meet the aspirations of the 3 races, the Europeans, the Indians, and the Fijians. The question of educational entitlements and that of uniform civil service proved to be too vexing for a person like Andrews, who believed that the 3 races would come together. I would like to end by saying that Andrews was a humanist who assumed a lot of things that might not have matched with the reality that was prevailing in colonies like Fiji. Racial discrimination was ubiquitous. The reach of the colonial sugar company loomed large, and the political aspirations of the Indians pushed them into a confrontation with the native Fijians. Andrews' own involvement in the movement against indenture and discrimination of the Indians in Fiji itself is part of a human journey involving movement across the 3 continents of Africa, Asia, and Australia. Andrews would not have been seriously involved in Fiji had he not been there, had he not gone through a similar experience earlier in South Africa. Indeed, the South African experience, his liking for Gokhale's moderate politics, and his strong bonds of friendship with Gandhi and Tagore drew him closer to the cause of the indigent Indians much more than any other human being. His love and admiration for the Indian laborers in Fiji rightfully earned for him the title of Dinabandhu. The end of indenture in 1920, therefore, remains largely a story of Andrew's commitment to a cause which went beyond the quotidian realizations of many in his own generation. Thank you.